Let's begin with a look at the economy and talk today about trickle-down economics. Now, this phrase actually dates back to the Great Depression, but it's closely associated with Republican Party hero President Reagan's economic plan, also known as Reaganomics or supply-side economics. In the modern day, it's the main argument for those who think the wealthiest Americans deserve bigger tax breaks because they are, after all, the job creators and will reinvest that money into hiring and building more wonderful businesses to fuel America. Well, guess what? That is never how things have worked. And it's certainly not what's happening now with those Bush tax cuts remaining in place. In fact, a new study has found that instead of trickling down, much of that wealth from the world's richest has actually been trickling, or rather overflowing, to offshore bank accounts. Take a look at this. You can see that blue portion there. On the bottom, that is money from the United States that flowed into offshore accounts. $459 billion in 2002, all the way up to $726 billion by April of last year. Joining me now from Niceville, Florida is Karl Denninger, proprietor of the Market Ticker. Hey there, Karl. Every country, of course, is guilty here, but we're in the U.S., so let's talk about the enormous wealth being made by U.S. business people and then trickling not down, but out. What do you make of this?
I think there's a little bit of a misnomer that goes with this. I mean, after all, this is after-tax income, so taxes have already been collected on this money. But there is an argument here to be made that we have a system where we have incentivized people to be unproductive. And Bill Clinton, in fact, tried to do quite a bit to change this and was rather successful in doing so. Now, a lot of people will look at that and say, well, you know, he happened to be president when there was a huge internet boom, and that had a lot to do with it, and it really didn't have much to do with productivity improvement and the common man. But the fact of the matter is that he did sign welfare reform legislation that cut the welfare rolls dramatically, and people went to work. So if you look at poverty from a standpoint of people's standard of living, and of course the basis is having a job and having something to do as opposed to not, there was certainly success to be found in the 1990s.
Well, you're saying, Karl, that you use the word incentivize. So the system that we have in place right now incentivizes people to move that money offshore. Are you talking about the corporate tax rate? What are you talking about? What's the biggest thing that is preventing these wealthy, quote-unquote, job creators from, in fact, creating jobs and keeping that money in the United States?
Well, the money goes somewhere. This is the misnomer, is that when you keep the money offshore, what you're doing is you're funding offshore businesses, either directly or indirectly. You're providing capital that can then be loaned out somewhere other than in the United States. And one of the realities of capital is that it is agnostic. It doesn't honor flags. It doesn't honor political parties. It goes where it's treated well. And so if you put in a system that incentivizes the movement of labor into places that have effective slave labor and use environmental arbitrage, in other words, dumping toxic waste into the air and water, where you can't do that here in the United States, then it's not a surprise that capital flows to where it can be exploited by those businesses. We need to take a very serious look at how we look at trade and how we look at policies related to trade and labor in that area, because we are essentially driving jobs and opportunities out of the United States. We've been doing it for 20 years.
But Karl, the fact is, some of these big companies, some of these big corporations that 20 years ago were making decent profits, the fact is that they haven't had to change their policies to keep those million and billion-dollar profits. Numbers show, Karl, that these corporations are making more and more than ever before, and a lot of that is because, you know, they're doing, like you say, they're opening up factories in India and China where they can pay people nothing. These people are still making more and more money.
Yeah, but you can't fix this by trying to tax that money away, because you're not going to change the incentives to have the labor there. What you have to look at is this a fair labor and production practice? And if it's not, we have in our Constitution the means to address that. It's called tariffs. And we just refuse to put them in place because we respond at a government level to those people who say, oh, free trade is the most important thing on the menu for everybody. And the truth of the matter is that it hurts the American worker, because those jobs then become uncompetitive to do here in the United States.
I think a lot of people, especially those that we've spoken to, heads of unions, might actually agree with that. But let's connect the dots here. I mean, how would the wealthiest citizens in this country simply keeping their money here as opposed to sending it offshore, how do you think it would change things?
I don't think it would change things at all because the money's already had taxes paid on it. So if they were to put it here in the U.S., what would be the difference? Functionally, it doesn't change anything. What you could do is try to tax it away from people. But as I pointed out some time ago in an article I wrote, if you were to tax all income over $250,000 a year at 100%, you couldn't close the budget deficit. The problem with doing that is, of course, the next year nobody would make more than $250,000 a year because they wouldn't get to keep any of it at all.
But you're saying things wouldn't change. I mean, I think that an argument can be made that these large corporations, these really wealthy people, if they kept it here and they created, instead of 2,000 jobs in India, perhaps they created 800 jobs in the U.S. Don't you think that would contribute to change, 800 new jobs here?
Sure, but the way you do that is you make it uneconomic for people to employ what amount to slaves in India, and the capital flows back to where it's being treated well, which in this case would be the United States. Actually trying to tax the money away isn't going to change the behavior. Someone who has that much money can simply choose to live in the Philippines or go somewhere other than the U.S. They can't be forced to stay.
And, we are starting to see that more and more. One of the co-founders of Facebook even left this country. We see multiple examples of people with a lot of money, getting rid of their U.S. citizenship so they don't have to pay taxes on the profits, the revenue that they made. I want to talk a little bit more about this report. Something I found pretty interesting that came out in this report is that Africa, which we know has major problems with poverty, if some of those oil-rich citizens would have paid taxes on their earnings, we're talking, a whole bunch of sub-Saharan African countries, they would be in better shape. You think about Nigeria and some of those people who make so much money on oil there. What was your reaction to that?
The gap between wealth and severe poverty, people who literally don't have anything to eat, tends to be well correlated with how corrupt your government is. And so what you have in these nations is essentially failed states where there is no rule of law, there is only the rule of the gun. And when you have that kind of thing going on, you have revolutions all the time and coups and all other kinds of things of that nature, then those people who have all the money get to keep all of it because there is no tax system you can impose that works, and everybody else goes hungry. So the solution to those problems is the rule of law. Unfortunately, we're seeing in the United States the same issues arise here in that we have people who have committed financial frauds in gross scale, and yet they've not been prosecuted. And so you have the same sort of disparity. It shows up here in the United States for the same basic reasons.
And speaking of that disparity, I think that there's some dots to be connected in the way that the wealthiest spend or hide their money, and also the fact that more and more people are having trouble staying afloat here in the United States.